At the beginning of this month, we talked about creation myth, and since we're nearing the end, I think it's time to look at the opposite end of that spectrum. Let's look at death and journeys to the underworld, baby! I am so excited about this. I love Journey to the Underworld myths, so let's get started. The first myth we're going to look at might just be the oldest myth we've talked about this month. It's the myth of Ishtar and Ereshkigal, also known as the descent of Inanna. Ishtar is a Mesopotamian era goddess of several different things, including war and fertility. Quite a combo that. And one day she decides that she is going to journey to the underworld. We'll get into her specific motivations a little later. Also, this underworld is a pretty miserable place to be. I mean, underworlds are usually never very happy, but this one is completely dark and the only food described there is dust. Ishtar knows that since she is alive, she's going to have a pretty hard time getting into the underworld. So as she approaches the gate, she says this: "Here, gatekeeper, open your gate for me. Open your gate for me to come in. If you do not open your gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. I shall raise up the dead, and they shall eat the living. The dead shall outnumber the living." The gatekeeper quickly responds to this by telling that he will go inform the goddess of the underworld, Ishtar's sister Ereshkigal. When he tells Ereshkigal what's going on, she's angry and a little confused as to why Ishtar would want to come down to such a miserable place. But she does let her in, telling the gatekeeper to treat her according to the ancient rites. What she means by this is quickly demonstrated, because as Ishtar is led through the 7 gates that lead to Ereshkigal, she's stripped of an article of clothing at each one. Justly concerned, she asks about this, and the servant answers that those are the ancient rites of the underworld. By the time Ishtar reaches her sister, she is stark naked and a lot less powerful. That's because her clothes are representations of her power and position that she holds in the world above. And since she's in the court of the dead, she's treated as such. Ereshkigal sends on her 60 diseases or turns her into a corpse. Either way, she's debilitated and cannot leave the underworld. Above ground, there are some noticeable problems, being that the goddess of fertility is essentially dead. Nothing can be born. The other gods take notice, but Ishtar prepared for this ahead of time. She told her vizier that if she didn't return, to go petition to her father. He does, and the father creates a person to go and take her place. His name in one of the versions was hilariously translated as Good Looks. Good Looks is sent to the underworld, and Ereshkigal is supplicated. She lets Ishtar travel back through the gates, allowing her to be clothed and to return to the world. And now to Ishtar's motivations, which are a little ill-defined. In later versions, the reason is almost always that she wants to tell her sister that her husband has died, which is a little odd because seeing how her sister is queen of the dead, she should know that. But in the primary version I used for this video, a much older text translated by Stephanie Dalley, she has no clear motivation. And I think this is important because if her motivation is she just wants to go down and tell her sister something, then Ereshkigal's response seems a little overreactive. But if she has no clear motivation and she just seems to be kind of encroaching on the dead, then the story becomes about the boundaries between the living and the dead and the consequences about trying to subvert them. The underworld is a place for the dead. Even a goddess can't change that. Now let's jump a little bit forward in time and talk about a Norse myth. Now the big event in Norse mythology, kind of its definitive feature for many people, is their end of days myth, Ragnarok. Now Ragnarok deserves its own video, so I won't go over it all here, but what you need to know is that there's this god Balder, and he's awesome. Like, everyone likes him, he's perfect. And if he dies, Ragnarok begins. And guess what? Balder's dead! Uh-oh, guess we better try to go reverse things before they get too out of hand. While most of the Aesir see to Balder's funeral pyre, Odin sends a god Herman down to negotiate with Hel. H-E single hockey stick Hel. This is Loki's child and goddess of the dead in Norse mythology. And like Hades, her name is often shorthand for her kingdom, but it does have its own actual name, Eljudnir. Herman rides 9 nights on the 8-legged horse Sleipnir before he reaches a bridge with a golden roof. There he's told that Hel is down and to the north. When Herman arrives at Eljudnir, he jumps over the gates on Sleipnir, and he arrives at a party held in Balder's honor. This is another example of how Baldur's just kind of the best by default. Hell is a nice place. It's a place that's described as having hunger as its dish and famine as its knife. But when good old Baldur shows up, it's time for a feast. Anyway, Herman negotiates with Hel about Baldur's release, and she puts up a little bit of resistance, but eventually agrees that if the Aesir can get everything, living and dead, to cry for Baldur, then she'll let him return to the living. Baldur gives Herman some gifts for the other gods, and he rides back to Asgard. When he gets there, he tells the Aesir about the conditions of his bargain with Hel. They quickly act upon this, going around and getting everything in the world, man, god, animal, stone, wood, anything to cry for Baldur. Everything except for one giantess named Thok, who says that Hel should keep what Hel has. It's said that Thok is just Loki in disguise, which would make sense. He did have a hand in Baldur's death, and the dead are his child's domain. But whether it is or not, it stays the same. Baldur's in Hell, and Ragnarok has begun. So in our stories thus far, we've had gods traveling to the underworld. But what about humans? Well, for that, let's go back to Greco-Roman myth and look at the Odyssey, at an underrated section, Book 11, The Kingdom of the Dead. This section has two reasons for existing. Well, kind of three, but then I'd have to go into a tangent about the framing story of the Odyssey, which is just too much for this video, so let's just say two. There's a narrative reason for this. Odysseus is having trouble getting home, so he goes to talk to Tiresias, the famous seer, who's, dead. But this also allows Homer to talk about what happened to some of the heroes who we don't get to see in the story of the Odyssey, because they're dead. So Odysseus and his crew sail to the underworld by the direction of Circe. When they get there, they dig a trench and fill it with milk and honey, meat and barley for the shades of the dead. Odysseus promises that once he gets home, he will sacrifice to all the dead and then slaughters a sheep. Whenever a shade comes up and drinks the blood of the sheep, they are able to talk to Odysseus. He first talks to a recently deceased shipmate, whose body is still above ground awaiting burial on Circe's island. He doesn't need to drink the blood because he hasn't been buried, so he just kind of floats up to Odysseus and asks him that he'll take care of his body properly so that he can rest in peace. This is a very humanizing moment for Odysseus because most of his shipmates are just unnamed people who get picked off one by one. But he actually gets to face the shade of one of the men he lost, and honestly, it's a very sad and heartbreaking conversation. He next talks to Tiresias, who tells him that all he and his shipmates need to do to ensure safe passage is not eat the sun god's cows when they get to his island. Psst, they end up doing that. Next he talks to his mother, who has died of sadness in his absence. She tells him that a group of suitors has come to his palace, eating up his food and trying to get with his wife, thinking that he's dead. Following this, he talks to a lot, and I mean a lot, of dead queens, and mostly all they talk about is how they either did it with a god or they had kids who were super successful. But the conversations that leave the most impact are the ones with the fallen heroes. He talks to Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks at Troy, and Achilles, the greatest hero of Troy, and Heracles, who's just kind of there. Agamemnon tells Odysseus the story about how when he returned home, he was killed by his wife. Now, logically, this makes sense in the mythology. He sacrificed their daughter before sailing off to Troy, so she had 10 years to let that simmer and a bunch of resentment boil to the top and then stabby, stabby, stabby. Well, that's not what Homer's doing here. What Homer's doing here is he's just using it as an example of why Penelope, Odysseus' wife, is so awesome. She's not only not going to kill Odysseus, but she's also putting up with 10 years of suitors just hanging out. She's stayed faithful, she's not murderous, which, are two traits that make a good life partner, so yeah. Achilles is a little bit more interesting. He talks about how life as a slave would be better than being dead and having a little bit of position in the underworld. This is an interesting reversal of his story in the Iliad, where he is a person who is destined to die young but live gloriously. Then Odysseus sees the shade of Ajax the Greater and tries to make up with him. They kind of had a rivalry going on in real life. He also sees Heracles' human ghost, even though his godly side is partying it up on Olympus, and as more and more shades come, he gets a little spooked and decides he and his crew should make a run for it. They make out of the underworld, keep sailing, and completely ignore Tiresias' advice, which was the whole reason they went. This is an interesting diversion from the rest of the Odyssey, as it allows Homer to expand the world and kind of show off how much he knows about lineages and obscure heroes, but it's beautifully written and it shows a unique underworld, one where you don't have to escape or break free, but one where Odysseus can just go and get some intel. And there we have it, a goddess encroaching on the bounds of death, an unfulfilled deal that results in Ragnarok, and Odysseus having the most depressing hangout sesh with his buds. I think that will do it for today. I'll see you tomorrow, VEDS. May our stories outlive us all.